name is Carol Ivy, and I am here pleased to introduce to you one of the 1992 honorees to the Marin Women's Hall of Fame. She is Jean Barnard, and she is truly a Renaissance woman. Jean, how do you react to that kind of an introduction? Are you a Renaissance woman?
I am happy that you think so. I know what you mean, and I have done a lot of different things.
Your life began with a great education. You had the value as a young woman of an education at Vassar, and you used it well. You were a Phi Beta Kappa in 1940, and I congratulate you for that. How difficult was it then for a woman to get that kind of an education?
Well, of course, Vassar was completely a woman's college, and now, since 1970, it's been co-ed. But we were just, I had an older sister, 2 years older, and she went to Vassar, and my brother went to Dartmouth, and it was just never even dreamed that we wouldn't go to college. Because despite its being Depression years, and my father was on Wall Street, and so things were pretty tough, but his company never went under, and really, I can't say that I ever had any hardships in my youth, but we were not rich by any means. And I was always so conscientious that the day that Franklin Roosevelt took office, you know, March 4th, 1933, why all the banks closed. It was the depth of the Depression. Everybody was very panicky. So I was at school, and I spent 2 cents for lunch.
Because you were worried about this.
Yeah, I've always been that kind of a person. I got only a cupcake. They were 2 cents.
How important, Jean, was your education to what you later went on to do? Do you feel that perhaps, you said you were expected to have that kind of an education, but do you feel that it was an enriching experience?
Well, yes, it was, but I also have to admit that too much emphasis was put, mainly by my mother, on our grades, our high marks, and she just informed us all. I can remember I was 8 years old when she said, "I want you all to be Phi Beta Kappas," and I said, "What's a Phi Beta Kappa, Mom?" And she told what it was, and you know, we all were. Some kids rebel against that kind of pressure, but we all were. My sister at Vassar, and I at Vassar, and my brother at Dartmouth.
You said you were reading about politics when you were 14 years old. During those years, as a child, a young woman, was it unusual for girls to be that interested in politics?
Oh, I'm sure that I've always been just kind of overboard about the state of the world. In fact, I compare myself to Cassandra in Greek mythology, who was always predicting disasters. But I wasn't gloomy. I was happy.
But did anybody ever say to you, "What's a girl doing interested in this"?
No. No.
So they didn't push you into music. It was something that just happened.
Well, I chose music instead of political science, and I've never been sorry for the reason that you can pick up political science, I assure you, as you go through life and you support candidates and you run for office and you do all those other things. You can certainly piece out a very good education in political science without getting it at college. But music, you see, is something that doesn't change at all. You learn to harmonize and ear training and all the things that go with the history of music. And it's just been a really great godsend to me. I was a piano teacher for 20 years, and I used my college instruction more than anything else as a piano teacher. But I was married when I was 21, and right out of college. In fact, I got engaged between junior and senior year, and I was married right immediately after college. And the world kind of opened up. There's just the opposite from women today, who say, "Well, now, should I commit myself to this man? Should I give up all the things I'm doing?" It's a totally different situation. There was no way of leaving home then except to get married. And fortunately, I was so fortunate in the choice, because my husband and I have been extremely happily married. But when we both got married, we said, "At last we're free." You know, that's the way we felt.
You two seem to be real soulmates, and I think that you didn't give up anything.
No, I didn't.
You just went right ahead with what Jean Barnard wanted to do. Is that right?
That's right, although I don't think that I didn't start too early. I was married at 21, had 2 sons, and that was during the war. My husband was never sent to war because he was canning pineapples for the Del Monte Corporation, and I do believe the entire war was won on pineapples. They took 95% of the pack for the Army.
Let's talk a little about Planned Parenthood.
Okay, yes, that was another thing.
Okay, there was something that to me, when you entered into your activities with Planned Parenthood, was still a very controversial issue, was it not?
Well, yes, it was, a very small little group that we had.
What was that like, Jean?
Well, as a matter of fact, we were such a struggling group that we decided that it would be smart if we joined up with San Francisco for a while. And so we dissolved ourselves in Marin and joined with San Francisco. And then after about 5 years, we sort of got on our feet again.
You told me a funny story about being well known in Mill Valley. As a member and activist with Planned Parenthood.
Oh, yes. Well, I was always so sold on the idea of 2 children, and no more, just 2 children. And so when the baby boom was on, you see, the men came back from war, and beginning in 1946, everybody was having 4s and 5s and 6 children, and I was very distressed about it, and I kept talking about it. I don't think it did much good, but people all had a joke. Well, when they saw anyone was pregnant, they'd say, "Have you cleared it with Barnard?"
That's wonderful.
Because we were in a church, of course. That's how we all knew each other so well, was in our church group. We've always been very active in church.
What was your first elected office? What was
the first elected office was the Mill Valley City Council.
It was?
Yes.
What motivated you to run for that position?
Always the environment. You see, because of being concerned about the environment, I started going to meetings. I went to every meeting of every board and commission and anybody who might be talking about some environmental matter. And I noticed who was on boards and how they were doing. And then the next step was to decide who was going to be a good member of a board and to support that candidate. And at one time, I swear, I had worked for 2 supervisors and 3 Mill Valley councilmen who all, I don't mean to sound as if I'm bragging, but they owed their election to me because they were kind of hair-trigger elections.
What about when you got elected to the city council? Yeah. Were you the only woman on the council at that point?
Oh, yes.
You were?
And I also was the only woman in 20 years. Yeah.
There had been a woman before you,
yes,
but it had been 20 years.
She was mayor. The very first woman in Mill Valley was Vera Schultz. She's very well known. And shortly after her, Miriam Cummings was elected and became mayor. Vera said she thought it was male chauvinism that kept her from being mayor. She never was made mayor. But Miriam Cummings was, and she served from 1952 to 54, and exactly 20 years later, I was mayor from 72 to 74, and there were no women on the council in all that time.
What was it like? Was there a lot of, shall we say, brouhaha, oh my gosh, a woman's been elected to the city council?
Well, one thing that it was like is that I was the top vote getter, and the city clerk told me, she said, you know, women don't often run. There hasn't been anyone running for 20 years, but when they do, they get the top vote, which was an interesting thing. One night, one of the councilmen said something very sarcastic to me. We were working on the budget, and I said, I forget what I suggested. It was something that cost a little money. And he said, "And is this Madam Watchdog of the budget talking?" Just in this sarcastic way. And I said, "Gentlemen," I don't know why I always called them gentlemen, but I always did, "Gentlemen, if you spent less time harassing me and more time governing Mill Valley, we'd get along better." And there was this dead silence in the city hall. But things were much better after that.
I was going to say, you have been much more successful than many of those gentlemen.
Yes, that's a fact. That's a fact.
It is a fact.
I've often thought of that.
But you had to try harder.
Yeah.
Do you feel as if you had to try harder?
Well, I definitely did in those days.
Let's talk about your great love, which is the environment.
Yes.
And some of the things that you can look back on and say, I had something to do with that. Bolinas Lagoon,
Yeah.
for instance. What do you think of when you think of that?
Oh, what I think of is the day at the Board of Supervisors when this tremendous quick action had to be accomplished in order to keep, there had to be an immediate switch between the ownership of the lagoon. It had to get into the hands of the Nature Conservancy without any elapsed time, so that it couldn't be, there couldn't be eminent domain exercised. So there was just the most immediate switch. It was just sudden, and Peter Bear, who was just the soul and heart of all that kind of thing, was out in the hall being interviewed. When he came back in, the deed was done. It was the most exciting day. It was February 14th, what year? But anyway, it was Valentine's Day.
It was Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
That was Valentine's for you.
Yes, it certainly was.
Golden Gate Recreation Area. This is something that has been very important in your life.
Well, yes, but the main aspect of it was defeating Marin. See, that was the part of it that we really worked on.
But all of these things were things that you went after with a fervor as an activist.
Absolutely.
It was more difficult then, but do you see people today who you think can take up the gauntlet, or do you think that people in these recessionary times are maybe becoming more self-centered and perhaps there aren't enough Jean Barnards out there?
Well, no, I feel as though there are a lot of wonderful young Jean Barnards. I mean, that's great, because I think it's, I don't know, I think it's time for me to quit.
We don't. We don't think it's time for you to quit. What would you do? You have lots more to do.
Well, no, I think that there's a big constituency for the environment now, much more so than back in those days. There were many fewer environmentalists than there are now.
Is it one of the things that you look at as one of your major accomplishments, though, as being one of the pioneers?
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely. I remember I was so glad when I began to read in publications like the Sierra Club Yodeler and the Sierra Club magazine, when they began to say the things that I'd been thinking for years, and I was just awfully glad that it was beginning to happen.
Your youth, you mentioned that you had had a lot of fascinating adventures. You mentioned the train trips. Do you think those things influenced you in your later years in terms of love of the land?
I don't know. Looking back, I think that it was the most wonderful thing to cross the continent by train. I can just remember the sights and sounds, and I loved the middle of the night. It would be so quiet. You know, we didn't have air conditioning, so our windows were open, and always when we were going to get to the Rockies, the porter would come through and say, giving you an extra blanket tonight, it's going to be cold going over the Rockies. And then in the middle of the night, out in the prairie area, you know, it'd be completely still, and then you'd hear the brakeman talking and getting ice and doing things on the platform. Those things are just thrilling memories to me, and the observation platform where you sat and watched the rails go out in front of you, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. I just loved it.
Some women have said that, you know, as we said early on, being married, having children caused them not to be able to do the things they wanted to do. Mm-hmm. Has your relationship with your husband actually been a help to you? And is it a good example of combining a family with these goals in life?
Well, yes, at one time I said, I sort of laugh about it because I don't think anybody agrees with me now, but at the time that our younger son was between marriages, because his first marriage didn't last, and so he was alone, and he wanted to be married. I said, why don't you just live with someone? He said, no, I want to be married. So, and I said, well, you know, I really do think, Jeff, that it takes two people to live one completely convenient, full, satisfying, and useful life. He said, "That's it, Mom, that's exactly it." And so it's worked that way with Jack and me, but I'm very lucky because he is so helpful. He's a real house husband, always has been, can fix anything, and good with the kids. He was a scoutmaster for 9 years, and so, you know, he's very, very good in every way like that.
Did that make a difference to what you wanted to do as a person active in the community, to not have to take all that burden on yourself, the child rearing?
Absolutely. He's always been so helpful.
Would that have been difficult had you had to do it all?
Oh, I think very much so. In fact, in that questionnaire that they asked us, what was your greatest obstacle, I didn't have anything to report in the way of the struggles of a single woman and with children, anything like that. Actually, what I listed as my greatest obstacle was the non-political nature of my parents and my sister, my brother. My parents were not only Republicans, but they were the kind of society Republicans, do you know what I mean, who are not really interested in politics. You just, oh, of course you vote Republican, naturally, you know, but they didn't give any thought to politics.
What happened when they realized they had this renegade daughter?
Well, they just didn't take any interest in it at all. They just didn't take any interest in it. I just pursued my own thoughts. They didn't offer any suggestions or anything. See, a lot of people have a role model in their mother. My father was a very silent man, but he was useful in the community, but very, very silent. My mother was the whole show.
Socially.
And she was social. That's it, exactly. She was purely social.
Are women better decision makers than men?
Well, I think so. I think it's just dippy to say that she thinks like a woman, or sometimes they say, well, she thinks like a man. That's just nonsense to put men's thought processes on a pedestal. I just think women are better at it. I really do.
Politically, sorting things out.
Sorting things out, sticking to the principles. That's been something that I noticed particularly, and others noticed it back in the earlier days of women on the city councils in various cities, that they were more likely to stick to the principles and not finagle or anything. Well, I remember one councilman, he was a nice guy, but one evening there was a question brought before the place, and he voted in sort of an unexpected way. It was kind of whimsical. He granted this garage to be put in a place where there really shouldn't be a garage. So I asked him afterwards, how come? And he said, well, she had nice gloves.
He said that?
He said that. So it was just kind of whimsy, but a woman wouldn't do that. That's my impression.
Now, I learned something very interesting about you tonight, and that is that your political roots in California go very deep. Tell me a little about that.
Well, my great-grandfather, my mother's grandfather, came around the Horn, because of course there wasn't any Panama Canal in those days, bringing my mother's mother. So the two of them, and I never heard, this is typical, I never heard much about my great-grandfather's wife. Isn't that the way? And he ran for governor of the state of California. His name was Caleb T. Fay, but I have looked in the history books, and I haven't seen his name, but I think that losing candidates don't make it much in the history books.
Still today.
Yeah,
Still
right.
today.
So, so my roots do go that deep, and my mother was born in San Francisco, and she had a twin sister.
Do some of the things that we hear about in politics today, again, not so much involving women, but involving men, some of the so-called political scandals in both parties, people being bought off, people being caught in sting operations, does that hurt you in terms of what you have tried to do as a person active in politics and trying to make government better?
Well, yes, it does, but it gives me more interest in women because I think an awful lot of it is male ego that leads men to doing the things that they do because they can't stand to be wrong, for instance. And look at Lyndon Johnson. Once he got into the Vietnam thing, he couldn't stand to lose. He couldn't admit error and just back out. So I think women are going to be better in that regard. I really do. In 1990, when my grandson graduated from Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, the speaker was not, the commencement speaker was none other than the Speaker of the House, Thomas Foley. So after the speech, Foley was out on the lawn of Whitman College, because you see Foley comes from Washington, from that area. And my husband was not walking along with me. I was walking along alone, which is very good, because sometimes when you're going to do something a little bit radical, you don't want to have to check with anybody else. So I was walking alone across the lawn, and I thought, this is my chance to speak to the Speaker of the House. So I wiggled through the reporters, and I went right up to him, and I said, Mr. Foley, I'm glad you're Speaker of the House, but the Democrats should be more aggressive. The Republicans have had us cowed for 10 years. And he made some non-aggressive answer. Of course, he's very gentle, you know. And so I slipped away. And the Washington Post reporter followed me. And he said, could I have your name? Many people are saying what you just said. And so, of course, I gave him my name and age and where I came from. And I said I was former mayor of Mill Valley. He put that in the Washington Post. Then, you see, that was May 20th. And then we went on our trip, my husband and I. We went all across Canada, as I told you. And when we got to Vassar, the timing was absolutely superb, because it was exactly 17 days later, and it happened to be the anniversary of Foley's becoming Speaker of the House. So the Washington Post, for that day, imagine, had a huge article, the front page, about Thomas S. Foley, huge picture of Foley. And the first paragraph said, Thomas S. Foley was dispassionately discussing the budget with reporters at Whitman College, Walla Walla, Washington, when Jean Barnard, former mayor of Mill Valley, said what I said. They quoted me exactly. And here it was on the front page of the Washington Post. Well, it was really exciting. My son phoned me from Washington to the alumni house at Vassar, and it really gave a real punch to the reunion.
You were just named Senior Citizen of the Year
yes.
in Mill Valley, along with your husband,
yes,
Jack.
That's right.
And first of all, you both are very active people, and I imagine your reaction to that was I don't think you were surprised, were you?
Well, only to the extent that we didn't know it was going to happen, but we weren't surprised in the sense of saying to ourselves, gee, how did they ever hit on us? We had been named Citizens of the Year together again. They put us together all the time, which is perhaps understandable. That was back in '81 that the Chamber of Commerce in Mill Valley named us Citizens of the Year. And now, 11 years later, why, this is Senior Citizens of the Year, which is natural progression.
Let me ask you about that. You mentioned, for instance, when the Washington Post reporter asked you who you are, and you said, I am so-and-so, former mayor of Mill Valley, and gave him your age, which reporters always ask.
Oh, yes.
And now you are a senior citizen.
Yeah.
You're a very beautiful woman and very active. Was it ever a problem for you to realize that you are a senior citizen, or is that something that's just this part of your life?
Well, the only thing is at the tennis club, because there are definitely young women coming along, and there's a difference.
But you still have the same power and the same energy. You're just...
Well, almost. Not as much. I take a nap in the afternoon for about a half hour now.
We should all do that.
Well, it helps to stay awake that night.
Do you have projects coming up, Jean?
Oh, well, yes, I'm president-elect of the AAUW chapter branch in southern Marin, and that's going to be quite a big job, because AAUW really keeps you supplied with literature in every mail, it seems like. It's an awful lot
What are your hopes for that? What do you hope to accomplish?
Well, what I hope to accomplish, actually, is to streamline it a little bit. I feel that there's too much. There's had. Too much being sent to us all the time, and too many meetings, and they're not as well attended as they should be, which I attribute to the fact that Marin is kind of over-organized. If we lived in perhaps Alpine County or something, where there wasn't so much going on, it would be very good, or maybe even in Kansas or Nebraska or something. But I think the Bay region is just jumping with activities. So I hope to take a look at the whole year, what's usually done, and I'm going to ask my board right off, what do we really want to do this year? And let's not try to do other things. Let's do the ones we choose, do them right, and that's what I hope to do.
Streamlining. Do you think
Yes,
that's important in all government agencies, Jean? Do you
Yes.
think we've done too much?
The proliferation is simply terrible. Do you know that, for instance, in Medicare, one of the terrible sources of cost overruns is that it takes 32 copies of something. They said it over the radio that there had to be 32 copies of something to get this particular permit through, and there's too much paperwork. It's just awful.
When you were a young woman politician, are those the kinds of things you were dealing with? Trying to change people's minds about just how complex the bureaucracy should be? And was it something you felt you tried to move things along, and how hard was it being a woman?
Well, the main thing, the trouble with being a woman on the city council, this is something I always noticed, is that I would express an opinion, and one of the men, my colleagues, would say, no, and that isn't it, and then say the same thing. Absolutely. They start with no, and then say the same thing. And then another thing I noticed is that they would say, oh, I agree with Ed, or I agree with Jeff, or something, but they never would agree with Jean.
How did that make you feel?
Well, I just knew what their problem was, that they couldn't agree with me.
And you worked around it?
Well, yeah, you just have to live with it. But that certainly used to be the case. But it was much better by the time I was in my second term on the water board, why people were perfectly at liberty to say they agreed with Jean or agreed with Patricia. There was a change.
Jean, I have to tell you as we wrap up here that I think you should be proud and look around Marin County in our beautiful, beautiful environment, and you can say to yourself, I did a lot of this. Do you do that often?
Well, yes, I really do, and that's one of the reasons I keep working at things and keep writing the letters. I wrote to Bush yesterday and Senator Gore today and all, because I like to feel that I've had something to do with anything good that happens. It's a good feeling.